Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving deep today into social psychology and, focusing in on social cognition.
Right.
Using this chapter,
Mm-hmm.
social cognition as a subtopic of social psychology. It's from a book called Social Cognition, The Construction of the Self in Social Contexts by Elin Gavriliuk.
Okay.
And we're going to try to figure out how did this field even come to be, and, where does social cognition fit in with all of that?
It's really interesting to see how social psychology kind of developed.
Yes.
Despite these origins in Europe, it feels like it really, it found its footing in the U.S. during the 20th century.
Kind of like rock and roll, right?
Yeah.
With,
Yeah.
deep roots in the blues. But it took American artists to really make it global.
Mm-hmm.
But before we jump over to the U.S. side of things, what was going on in Europe?
Well, they were already thinking about, the impact of social environments on individuals.
Okay.
Like back in the 19th century, researchers like Steinthal and Lazarus were already looking at, language, myths, and customs to try and understand what they called the psychology of peoples.
So they were kind of like cultural anthropologists then.
Exactly. They were trying to, figure out how our social context shapes our beliefs and behaviors.
Makes sense.
And then you have someone like Gustave Le Bon, who was studying crowd psychology.
Oh, yeah.
And he had this idea that people kind of lose their individuality when they're in a crowd.
Right.
And they become, more susceptible to suggestion and could even behave irrationally.
Yeah, mob mentality.
It really highlights the power of, these social forces.
For sure.
Then you have Emil Durkheim, who coined this term collective consciousness.
Oh, yeah. I've heard that.
He was really fascinated by, the shared beliefs and values that actually hold societies together.
So even back then, they were starting to understand just how much our social world influences us.
Absolutely. And as social psychology, grew and developed all of these ideas, like individual minds, group dynamics, cultural influences, they all started to weave together.
It all comes together.
But, it's important to mention that the European and American traditions within the field, they have some, differences.
Also, different flavors of social psychology.
Yeah, you could say that Gavriliuk even points this out, that the European tradition tends to go towards, these broader, more sociological interpretations.
Okay.
While the American tradition, especially in those early years, they were really focused on the individual and using experimental methods.
So two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
Each one bringing something different.
Exactly.
How did these different schools of thought actually play out?
Well, one of the early figures who kind of bridged that gap was William McDougall.
Okay.
In 1908, he wrote a book called An Introduction to Social Psychology.
Okay.
And he kind of put forth this theory of instincts. He thought, that our social behaviors are driven by these innate, biological tendencies.
So he's saying we're hardwired to be social.
Yeah, that was his idea. Now, his theory might not hold up completely today, but it was a big step, towards understanding the roots of social behavior.
Like trying to find that missing link between our biology and our social selves.
Exactly. And that's where, figures like Floyd Allport come in.
Right. Floyd Allport was huge in the U.S.
Oh, yeah. His 1924 book really helped establish social psychology as a distinct scientific discipline in the U.S.
It's a big deal.
Yeah, he was a big advocate for using experimental methods and, really emphasized the individual as the central thing to look at.
Right.
His work really set the stage for, some of the biggest names in the field.
Okay, so now we're talking about Muzaffar Sharif, Kurt Lewin, Solomon Asch, Leon Festinger, Stanley Milgram.
Yeah, all the big names.
These are the people who put social psychology on the map.
Yeah, those mid-20th century years were a hotbed of activity with each one of those figures, making groundbreaking contributions to our understanding of, conformity, obedience, group dynamics, social influence, you name it.
It's huge.
Yeah, they were asking questions like, why do we conform to group norms? How far will we go to obey authority, even if it means, going against our own conscience?
These are big questions about human nature.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
How do they even begin to tackle these questions?
Well, that's where those experimental methods that Allport was a big fan of, they really come in.
Okay.
Think about Solomon Asch's famous conformity experiment.
Oh, yeah, the ones with the lines.
Exactly, where people were shown lines of different lengths.
Yeah.
And had to say, which one matched a target line.
Yeah.
And what he found was that people were surprisingly willing to conform to the group's obviously wrong answer.
Oh, wow.
Even when they knew it was incorrect.
That's kind of disturbing, but also fascinating at the same time.
It is.
it makes you realize how susceptible we are to social pressure, even when, it goes against what we're seeing.
It's powerful.
Yeah.
And then you have Leon Festinger's groundbreaking work on cognitive dissonance.
Yes.
This is the idea that when our beliefs and our actions clash,
Right.
it creates this discomfort, and we try to reduce that discomfort by changing our attitudes or behaviors.
Wait, so you're telling me that we sometimes change our beliefs to match, like, our actions, even if those actions were maybe not so great?
Yeah, it's kind of mind-blowing, but it has huge implications for understanding everything from decision-making to, prejudice.
Wow.
But perhaps one of the most controversial and, thought-provoking studies of this era was Stanley Milgram's obedience experiment.
The ones with the electric shocks.
Yes, exactly, where participants were told to, administer electric shocks to another person.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. Pretty intense stuff.
Oh, yeah. To say the least, Milgram's work showed the incredible power of authority figures to influence our behavior, even when it involves, inflicting harm on others.
I can see why those experiments generated so much debate.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about how you would act in that situation.
For sure.
But, as disturbing as some of them are, these studies, they really, push the boundaries of what we knew about social influence.
Absolutely. They were pivotal. And, as social psychology kept evolving, it started to tackle real-world problems, like moving beyond the lab and into areas like education marketing, healthcare,
Oh, wow.
and even conflict resolution.
So it became clear that understanding social behavior wasn't just, an academic exercise.
Right.
It had real-world applications.
Exactly. But as the field matured, there was a silent revolution happening.
Ooh, a silent revolution.
The cognitive revolution, as it's called.
Okay.
It started to shift the focus to the mental processes that underlie social behavior.
So it's like zooming in on the inner workings of the social mind.
Precisely. And this is where social cognition emerged as a dominant force, trying to understand, how we perceive, process, and interpret social information.
So like attention, memory, reasoning, all those cognitive processes, but, with a social twist.
You got it. And that's where we'll pick up in our next segment, exploring how social cognition, carved its unique space within this larger field of social psychology.
Sounds like we're about to go even deeper into the fascinating world of the social mind.
Yeah.
Can't wait.
And what's really cool about social cognition is that it's not just about these cold cognitive processes.
Yeah.
It also, considers the role of culture, emotions, and individual experiences and how we see, the social world.
So it's not just, how our brains process information.
Right.
It's also about our hearts and our backgrounds.
It's about, recognizing that human experience is complex and how these factors shape our social reality.
Totally. Okay, so I'm with you, but before we get too deep into, social cognition, I'm kind of curious. You mentioned earlier that social psychology started to tackle real-world problems. What were some of the early examples of that?
Well, think about, World War II.
Oh, yeah.
The atrocities of the war really raised these urgent questions about, prejudice, conformity, and obedience. And those were questions that, social psychologists were in a unique position to address.
So it was like the world needed answers.
Yeah.
And social psychology was there to offer insights.
Exactly. Researchers like Theodore Adorno, who was part of the Frankfurt School, they started exploring the roots of authoritarianism.
Oh, wow.
Trying to understand how certain personality types were more prone to these extremist ideologies.
After witnessing something like the Holocaust, people really wanted to understand how such a thing could happen.
Yeah.
It's like trying to prevent it from ever happening again.
Absolutely. And then you have Gordon Allport Floyd's brother.
Right.
He really dug deep into the nature of prejudice.
Okay.
His book, The Nature of Prejudice, became like a foundation for studying prejudice.
Good soror stone.
Yeah, exploring all these psychological and social factors that contribute to it.
So they were moving beyond just describing these phenomena and actually trying to understand what causes them.
Yeah, it was a huge turning point.
Yeah, huge.
And as the field continued to grow, it branched out into more diverse areas.
Okay, like what?
Well, for example, Kurt Lewin's work on group dynamics had a big impact on organizational psychology.
Oh, interesting.
It helped businesses understand how to improve teamwork and productivity.
That's cool. So it's like this seemingly abstract research can have real-world applications.
Absolutely. And that trend of applying social psychology to real-world issues has just kept growing.
Yeah. For sure.
Today, you see social psychology principles being used in everything from marketing and advertising to healthcare and public policy.
It's like social psychology has become this like secret weapon to understand and influence human behavior in all sorts of contexts.
You could say that, but let's not forget about the, silent revolution we talked about earlier.
The rise of cognitive social psychology.
Yeah, the shift towards understanding the mental processes, behind social behavior.
Right.
That was crucial for the development of social cognition.
Okay, so remind me again, why was this cognitive revolution such a big deal?
Well, up until then, behaviorism was like the dominant school of thought in psychology.
Okay.
Behaviorists believed that the only things you could study scientifically were observable behaviors.
Oh.
They weren't interested in what was going on inside people's minds.
So it's all about like stimulus and response?
Exactly.
Like training a dog with treats?
Yeah, but,
It seems kind of limited.
it is. Humans are more complex than that.
Yeah, we are.
And that's what the cognitive revolution challenged.
Okay.
It said you can't fully understand human behavior without thinking about the mental processes,
Right.
The thinking, the perceiving, the remembering.
So finally acknowledging that we have these like rich inner worlds
Right.
that shape our actions.
Exactly. And this shift opened up a whole new way of exploring, social behavior.
Okay.
Researchers started asking, how do we form impressions of others? How do we make sense of confusing social situations?
Right.
How do our past experiences, affect our current perceptions?
Like they were cracking open the black box of the social mind.
Yeah, and that's where social cognition comes in.
Okay.
It takes these cognitive processes and applies them to our social world.
Right.
Social cognition emerged as a dominant force within social psychology, focusing on how we, perceive,
Yeah.
process, and interpret social information.
It's like putting those cognitive tools to work
Exactly.
in the world of human interaction.
Yeah.
Okay. I see how it all fits together. But what makes social cognition unique?
One key concept is the idea of schemas.
Schemas, that sounds familiar.
They're like these mental frameworks
Yeah.
or shortcuts that help us make sense of the world.
Right, so it's like a mental filing system.
You could say that, we might have a schema for what a typical professor is like.
Right.
Maybe they're older, wear glasses, carry a briefcase,
Right.
and talk about, obscure academic theories.
I can see how that schema would be helpful if I met a new professor. I'd already have some expectations about how they might behave.
Exactly. But what happens if you meet a professor who doesn't fit that schema at all?
Right, like what if they're young, wear ripped jeans, and talk about their latest skateboarding adventure?
That's where things get interesting.
Right.
When we come across information that doesn't fit our existing schemas, we can either, try to fit it into our existing schema,
Okay.
or we might adjust our schema, create a whole new category for this unexpected experience.
So our schemas are always being challenged and updated.
Exactly. It's a dynamic process of learning and adapting.
And that's what makes social cognition so interesting.
Yeah.
It's about understanding how our minds create our social realities.
It is, and I bet this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to social cognition, right?
I've got to be more.
Oh, yeah. There's a whole world of fascinating concepts and theories
Okay.
within social cognition.
Mhm.
But before we get into those, let's take a step back and consider, one of the most important ideas in this field, the concept of attribution.
Attribution. I've heard that before.
Yeah,
Isn't that about how we explain why people do what they do?
exactly. Attribution theory is all about how we make sense of, the causes behind people's actions.
Okay.
Do we think their behavior is because of internal factors,
Right.
like their personality or disposition,
Okay.
or do we think it's external factors like the situation they're in?
So let's say I see someone yelling at a barista in a coffee shop.
Yeah.
Do I assume that they're just a jerk? Or do I consider maybe they're having a really bad day and something happened?
That's a perfect example.
Okay.
And attribution theory explores, the biases and errors that we often make when we make these judgments.
Okay.
For instance, we tend to overemphasize internal factors when we're explaining other people's behavior.
Right.
It's called the fundamental attribution error.
So we're more likely to think that the yelling customer is just mean, rather than thinking, they might be going through something we don't know about.
Exactly. We often jump to conclusions about people's personalities without thinking about, the situation.
Makes sense.
But on the flip side, we tend to give ourselves the benefit of the doubt.
Oh, really?
Blaming traffic for being late instead of just admitting we didn't leave on time.
Right.
It's called the actor-observer bias.
So we have double standards for judging ourselves and others.
It's a classic human bias, but these are just a couple of examples of the interesting insights that social cognition offers.
Right.
As we go deeper into this field, we'll uncover even more about how our minds create our social worlds.
This is blowing my mind. What else is coming up as we continue to dive into social cognition?
Well, next we're going to talk about heuristics.
Okay.
Those mental shortcuts that help us make quick judgments but can sometimes lead to predictable errors in thinking.
Sounds interesting. Can't wait to unpack those mental shortcuts and see where they lead us. All right, so we were talking about heuristics last time, right? Those mental shortcuts our brains use to navigate the social world.
Right.
And I think we left off on the idea that, they can sometimes lead us in the wrong direction.
Yeah, they can. Heuristics are super efficient.
Right.
They let us make these quick judgments without having to, overthink things.
Right.
But that efficiency comes with a cost. Because they rely on, these simplified rules of thumb. They can sometimes lead to errors in thinking.
So like a trade-off speed and efficiency for accuracy.
I mean, think about it. Our ancestors probably relied on heuristics to make those split-second decisions, when facing danger.
Okay.
Was that rustling in the bushes a predator or just the wind?
Right, fight or flight.
Yeah, but those same heuristics can trip us up in our modern world.
Oh, okay, I see what you mean. Can you give me an example of how these heuristics can, mislead us?
Sure. Think about the availability heuristic.
Okay. This is that tendency to judge how likely something is to happen based on, how easily we can think of examples. Like if you just saw a bunch of news reports about shark attacks,
Right.
you might think you're way more likely to get attacked by a shark, even though statistically it's super rare.
So it's like our brains are saying, if I can remember it easily, it must be important or more common.
Exactly. And that can really distort our perception of risk
Yeah.
and lead to irrational decisions.
Like being more afraid of flying than driving.
Exactly. Even though driving is statistically way more dangerous.
Yeah, because plane crashes are all over the news.
Yeah, they're more memorable.
Right.
So they're more available in our minds.
Our brains are wired for drama.
That's right.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So what other kind of heuristics can mess us up?
Well, there's the representativeness heuristic.
Okay.
This is the tendency to judge, whether something belongs in a category based on how similar it is to our prototype of that category.
Yeah.
Okay, can you explain that a little more? What do you mean by prototype?
Sure. Let's say you meet someone who's quiet and shy and loves reading.
Okay.
You might assume they're a librarian.
Yeah, more than like a salesperson.
Right, even though there are way more salespeople than librarians in the world.
Right.
It's because the person you met fits your idea of what a librarian is like.
So we use these mental shortcuts to categorize people and make
Yeah.
snap judgments.
And while that can be helpful sometimes,
Yeah.
it can also lead to prejudice and discrimination.
Right, because if we have negative stereotypes about a certain group,
Exactly.
we might unfairly judge people from that group based on those stereotypes.
Right, rather than seeing them as individuals.
Makes sense. So we're constantly bombarded with information. So our brains use these heuristics to simplify things and make quick decisions. But those shortcuts can lead to, biased or inaccurate judgments. So it's all about being aware of these biases and trying to think more critically.
Absolutely. Awareness is key. And that's one of the biggest, contributions of social cognition.
Yeah.
It helps us understand the hidden biases and mental processes that shape how we see and interact with the social world.
So we've talked about schemas, heuristics, attributions,
Right.
all these cool concepts that show us how our minds work in the social world.
Yeah.
But how does all of this connect back to social psychology in general?
Well, remember, social psychology is all about understanding how people think, feel, and behave in social situations.
Right.
Social cognition gives us the tools to go deeper into those cognitive processes
Right.
that underlie those thoughts, feelings, and behaviors.
So it's a way to look at the complexities of the social world.
Yeah, exactly. It helps us understand how our perceptions, interpretations, judgments are shaped by our experiences, our backgrounds, even our own quirks and biases.
And the more we understand these things, the better we can navigate the social world, make good decisions, and maybe even challenge our own biases.
Exactly. It empowers us to be more mindful and aware of the interplay between our inner world and the social forces around us.
This has been so insightful.
Great.
I feel like I have a whole new understanding of how complex the social mind is.
And we've really just scratched the surface.
Right, right?
The field of social cognition is always growing. New research and ideas are popping up all the time.
Right.
But I think the takeaway here is this understanding social cognition helps us understand ourselves, our relationships, and the society we live in.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive into social cognition, I think the challenge for us all is to take these ideas and apply them to our own lives.
Good.
Be more aware of our own biases, think critically about the information we're taking in, and try to be more understanding and empathetic when we interact with others.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Remember, this journey of discovery never really ends.
It's true.
And with this understanding of social cognition, we're all better equipped to navigate this amazing and constantly changing social world.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
We'll be back next time with a brand new topic to explore. Until then, keep those cognitive wheels turning.